Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to the first of our real big lectures here in Honors Research Seminar. And as you looked at the syllabus, our areas of study are going to be centered around culture, identity, and politics. Now, as I mentioned in the first lecture, and as I indicated within the syllabus, a good chunk of this class's readings and assignments are taken from a pre-existing class that I teach within political science called Politics and Culture. It's one of my all-time favorite classes to teach. It's one that students over the years have really liked. The bonus for all of you is that it functions really as a way of helping you do research, write papers, think analytically, ask critical questions, but I have watered it down to its bare bones structure. So I took out a lot of the more, historical, anthropological things to really focus on the theoretical elements of understanding culture and different approaches to political culture. So we've got 2 weeks to examine this first section, which is really coming to understand the different approaches to what exactly culture is within the social science discipline. Now, as an added bonus to this, I think what I'm going to do is put the 2 required readings for next week. So if you've already done the David Laitin and the Sugrue readings, congratulations. You can kind of sit back and just kick in the material that I'm going to offer for this lecture. And we can certainly bring up the 2 readings in class on Wednesday, but I want to save, real analytical discussion of them and the 2 faces of culture for the following week. So what are we going to do this week? This week is, what I normally do in the beginning of every semester, spend a good deal of time introducing some of the big concepts to students that, otherwise have a little rudimentary knowledge of the topic. In this case, it's going to be culture. So while there's no particular assigned readings for this lecture, the material is taken from readings that I would normally assign in this class. And if anybody's interested, maybe I'll just upload the readings to Blackboard and it can be there for your leisure. You can use these readings for your papers. If you're interested, you can just, have them at your disposal. But what I'm drawing from today are really from 2 scholarly writings. The chapter Culture in Comparative Political Analysis by Mark Howard Ross. This was published about 10 or so years ago in a reader on comparative politics. And then there is the standalone article, The Many Voices of Political Culture by Richard Wilson. Wilson used to teach within the poli-sci department at Rutgers, where I come from. I know him personally. He's long since retired, but, altogether good guy. And then next week, we're going to look at David Laitin's chapter, The 2 Faces of Political Culture. He's a big anthropologist, political anthropologist from the University of Chicago. And then the Sugrue article from Jacobin, Remembering Dr. Martin Luther King. I'm sorry I didn't put that one up here for the list of readings. So our goal for this week is simply to understand and dissect the different approaches to understanding culture. So your assignment for Wednesday's meeting is to listen to this video lecture, take notes, and come to class with some questions and observations about the very concept of culture, right? The more that we can understand culture, the more we'll be able to delve into the more research analytical aspects of this class, right? So without further ado, let's get started. And I'd like to begin by giving you an assignment. Yes, an assignment already, no rest for the weary. But it's an easy assignment, right? It's one that you're not necessarily going to be graded on, but one that we can use for our discussions on Wednesday. I want you to, in about a minute or so, I want you to list as many things you can think of when the word culture comes to mind. Okay? You don't need to be fancy, you don't need to write an essay, just brainstorm. Just literally a bullet point list. But don't, if you picture me with my hand, going from top to bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, just whatever comes to mind, right? Pause the video, give yourself about a minute to a minute and a half, and when you're done, take the list and send it to my email, michael.rossi@liu.edu. Or better yet, just save yourself the extra step and just put it in an email immediately. You don't need to write anything else. Just I want to see your name and give me a list of what comes to mind when the word culture is mentioned. Okay, I will assume that you have paused the video and that you're back listening now, and we can move forward here. Okay, now. Let's begin with a few definitions, right? Because I'm sure that you've heard of the word culture, and I'm sure you have, I guess, a understanding of it, but it's kind of hard to pinpoint. So that's where us, academics come in and try to complicate things while we're attempting to simplify. When we talk about culture, or more specifically, political culture, okay, because this is a political science, social science class that's being offered here. I like to go with the definition that Myron Aronoff had offered in the Encyclopedia of Political Culture, among other things. And he says that political culture constitutes the socially constructed and tenuously shared meanings which endow or challenge legitimacy in the political institutions, offices, and procedures of a polity. Political culture is employed to establish or contest the legitimate parameters of collective identity. All right, now, there's a lot of things to unpack here. So we're going to spend a couple of minutes dissecting this definition to help give you a sense of what exactly is being meant. So let's take this sentence by sentence. Political culture constitutes the socially constructed and tenuously shared meanings. Let's just stop right there. Okay? And if you're taking notes, underline socially constructed and tenuously shared. Because right off the bat here, both socially constructed and tenuously shared means that culture is not necessarily something that is amorphous, ubiquitous, omnipresent. But there is some kind of creativity. There is some kind of social construction that goes into what we understand culture to be. So if we understand culture being socially constructed, then it's not that difficult to infer from that culture is also tenuously shared. Because culture, whether it is, an item, a memory, a ritual, a tradition, a food, what have you. Each of these things carries different meanings, different understandings, group to group. It doesn't mean that these understandings are completely different from one another, but there's a large degree of overlap. There's a large degree of similarity, but there's a few nuanced understandings that one can examine. Like if let's say we take the culture of the American flag, right? No one is going to deny that it represents the one of the main primary symbols of the United States. But does the American flag invoke a variety of meanings, a variety of feelings and emotions, depending upon who is looking at it and who is flying it? And I think it's also fair enough to say that, if you're an American citizen, the American flag means a little bit more to you than if you were, let's say, a citizen of Romania, or Cambodia, for that matter. For us, the Romanian flag, I'll bet you some of you don't even know what the Romanian flag looks like, or let alone the Cambodian flag. But people from Romania or Cambodia have a different reaction to their own respective flags. Now, when we talk about tenuously shared, right, we also imply that there are variations on themes of culture. There are different approaches. There's different collective understandings of certain cultural practices and traditions. Okay? So that right then and there, we know that culture is not some monolithic, taken for granted entity, but there is definitely a human construction that goes into culture. A construction which, going back to the definition, endow or challenge legitimacy in the political institutions, offices, and procedures of a polity. Now, this is what adds the political aspect to political culture, right? Because by itself, culture is just kind of there, and it just kind of does, whatever we want it to do. But political culture is understood to be somewhat of a tool, a resource, either for people in power or people outside of power, like, normal citizens. When we talk about culture, political culture, endowing or challenging legitimacy of institutions, offices, and procedures, we reach an understanding that culture is at the heart of authority, recognizing authority or rejecting authority. So for those in power, the use and in many cases abuse of culture is a mechanism for trying to assert one's authority and invoke public legitimacy. So that's the reason why people in power constantly hearken to cultural symbols like flags and anthems, or various cultural landmarks, or they give gratuitous references to certain events in history that are part of a group's cultural heritage. Likewise, on the opposite end, if people in power somehow abuse culture, or they oftentimes misuse culture, misuse identity, right? The public can use these very same instruments of culture as a way of challenging what they feel are illegitimate people in power. So one just, idea that immediately comes to mind right now are, protesters in the United States that, are against, liberal left-wing politics. They're against, the Democratic Party, or against Obama. When people want to show patriotism, what's the first thing that they do, right? They bring their flags. They have various American symbols. Some of them might be controversial, like, Confederate symbols in this sense, right? But, clearly when there are political rallies, especially nationalistic rallies, either to support Trump or to challenge, anti-American sentiment or whatever it is, they're going to drag out their symbols, they're going to drag out their cultural traits, and they're going to use their tenuously shared understandings of culture as a way of asserting, right, collective political identity vis-a-vis, whatever target that they are rallying against. The last part of this definition, political culture is employed to establish or contest the legitimate parameters of collective identity. So right here also, Aronoff is saying that culture is a significant unit of measurement that defines, regulates, and differentiates between the us and the them. Who are we? What do we stand for? What are we against? Who is not part of our group? Whenever politics is involved, or we don't even have to talk about politics, right? We can talk about sports, identification, right? In the same way, people constantly talk in this country today about, how politics is so volatile, that people are just fanatically loyal to one party or one ideology or another. This has never happened in America before. And I have to say, y'all have never seen baseball games. Y'all have never seen American football games, right? If you're a Yankees fan, you just automatically hate the Red Sox, or you look down upon and joke about the Mets. And if you're a Mets fan, you can't stand the smugness of Yankees fans, right? If you're a Giants fan, you kind of wonder why in the world Jets fans even exist in the world. And if you are a Jets fan, man, you just constantly have to fend off attacks and ridicule from everyone. And if you ever happen to be in Philadelphia and you speak ill of the Eagles, oh, trust me, they're going to run you out of town as fast as possible here. So, it's when we talk about political culture in this sense, it doesn't necessarily have to be politics, but it's group identity. collective identity that defines and shapes and organizes collective beliefs, attitudes, and practices that differentiate one group from another. I know there's a lot of stuff to take in, but you're probably already thinking to yourself, wow, culture is a bit more nuanced and sophisticated than, I may have otherwise thought. To take this one step further, Aronoff argues, political culture refers to the meanings attributed to politics, right? The meanings. Make sure that you underline meanings. A central concern is the role of political culture in the transformation of ideas into power, and power either into authority or into challenges to authority. So, going in the other direction, away from political science and deepening into anthropology, sociology, and even psychology, political culture, are really the meanings, the emotional meanings, the feelings, the understandings that are attributed to politics, to some form of collective action. In this case, culture is a way of transitioning ideas into power, and then through, the electoral process, through the structure of politics, either electing that power into legitimate authority, or if not, into challenges against some authority. So culture is kind of like the fuel that gets people to think one way versus another way. It gets them to believe in certain things, to defend certain things, to uphold certain things, right? It's the stuff that we do, and it explains why we identify with the things that we identify with. And, we can sort of plug in different examples to cases, in our class on Wednesday to give you a better sense of what all of this means. Finally, an additional reading from Lucian Pye and Sidney Verba. This is, big culture and politics from 1965. Political culture places political systems in sets of meanings and purposes, specifically in symbols, myths, beliefs, and values. What we mean here is that, it's kind of hard to identify culture, seeing as how it's sort of a mental construct. You can't really describe culture unless you're describing something tangible, like the food that we eat at a certain time of the year on a particular holiday, like, Thanksgiving. What do we have on Thanksgiving? Turkey. Now, even if you're a vegetarian or whatever, you just kind of know that turkey and Thanksgiving just sort of go together. Christmas trees and Christmas, go together. Eggs and Easter, go together. Beer and barbecue on July 4th, and fireworks, go together in that sense. But in all of this, we are referencing tangible, entities, tangible symbols, right? The turkey is a symbol. The tree is a symbol. The egg is a symbol. And these symbols sort of produce their own myths, beliefs, and narratives. We're going to get to these things, in due time throughout the semester. But I'm kind of really breaking culture down into like its quantum physical mechanics here, right? To kind of show you that, yes, culture is just the stuff that we do. Why do we do it? I don't know. We just do. We've always done it, and I kind of feel weird not doing it. But if you break it down into its atomistic pieces, we do the things that we do because they're somehow important, and we feel that there is a need to continue doing them, upholding them, carrying on certain traditions, even if the things that we do are weird to the outside observer, almost silly, but we do them anyway because there is a meaning and a purpose attached to it. And oftentimes by not doing it on certain days or for certain reasons, the day, the reason, the event becomes less important, right? Less meaningful in that sense, right? So we've spent a really good deal of time, not even, I don't think, defining culture, but just trying to explain it in a more micro-analytical fashion. But when we try to figure out how culture contributes to politics, to institutions, to collective identity, right, we have to break this down even further. And this is taken directly from the Mark Howard Ross article, which, you know what, I'm just going to put it up there on Blackboard anyway. If you want to read it, great. If you don't worry about it. It's not required, but, I'm never going to deny students the opportunity for additional reading here. If we begin, probably in the most abstract, formulaic way, we understand culture to be a political frame. Right? Culture as a political frame is really stage one. And what do I mean here? In this sense, as a political frame, culture orders political priorities by defining symbolic and material objects people consider valuable, and here's the key, worth fighting for. So this is taken directly from David Laitin, right, page 11. The key thing here is it defines and identifies the stuff that we consider to be worth fighting for, worth defending, worth preserving, worth upholding. Okay? You all have something in your life. You all have some possession. You all have some memory. You all have some practice, some whatever it is, right, that you probably don't even think about, but you know is important to you. Whether it's a language that you speak other than English and you feel is important to, pass on to your children, a religious practice that, you might not be the most, actively practicing Christian, Jew, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever, but it does define, in a way who you are. It defines your family's ethnic heritage. It defines your place in the world. And, you feel that, it is important enough for you to, at least keep. You think about it like this. You're cleaning out your room, and this happens, every so often, right? And you're like, okay, I can get rid of this, I can get rid of this. And every so often, you got a few items in this one drawer, and you just, every time you clean, you're like, do I really need this or not? When was the last time I used this? When was the last time I did anything with this? But you can't bring yourself to throw it out. You can't bring yourself to get rid of it. So you decide to, even if you put it back in the drawer, and even if the next time you look at it is the next time you decide to throw it out 6 months later, you're going to do the same thing. Right? You're going to do this. You're going to do the exact same thing. Right? So worth fighting for means that there are things that have sentimental value to not only the individual, but also the group. And when we talk about group culture, right, as a political framework, culture defines interests and how they are pursued through community, authority, and conflict. So beyond just the individual's connection to culture, there's group culture. And the group culture helps shape how interests, how goals and aspirations are pursued, how authority is measured, and how conflict is waged and when conflict arises. Knowing that there are a certain set of collective cultural traits within a group, culture in the second stage frames group preferences, right? And in this sense, it connects the fate of the individual with the group through collective identification and a common fate. So if you choose to identify with a group, a political group, a social group, an athletic group, the group's fate is your fate. You may not do anything that day to make or break the group's fate that day. But if the group has a victory, you feel that victory. If the group suffers a defeat, you feel that defeat. Let's just go back to professional athletics, because it's just one of these things that, when you really think about it, following professional sports is kind of absurd. I mean, I don't want to give away the cards about what I feel about baseball, football, hockey, basketball, or, European or, world football, soccer. But, if you've got a team, regardless of the sport, that you just, just fanatically follow, right? Whether it's the Yankees or, Real Madrid or, the, New Jersey Devils or the LA Lakers, whatever it is, right? If your team wins that day, you feel like you won. You didn't do anything. You just sat there and you watched them on TV. And if they lose, you feel deflated. Even worse, if your team loses to the, arch enemy of your group, you feel angry. You feel betrayed. You want to go out there and, flip a car over or whatever. Again, nothing happened to you. But because you identify with that group, you feel as if you were either afflicted or you reap in the benefits. Okay? Look, my political ideology, I'll just, I'm happy to say it, I tend to be increasingly left-wing, all right? Left-wing, progressive, unapologetic, Bernie Sanders fan, right? Love the guy to death, all right? Why? Just because the guy is fighting for universal health care, $15 minimum wage, Green New Deal. The guy basically wants for the United States what every other developed country in the world wants. So, when his popularity was rising, I'm like, oh, we're going to do this. This is great, whatever. And when his campaign was basically sabotaged by the DNC, I felt betrayed. And, there's a lot of people who are Bernie Sanders supporters who may not even vote for Joe Biden. And it doesn't mean that we're going to vote for Trump, but, there's a part of us that actually feels there's no difference between Trump or Biden. And, if people are raising their eyebrows about what I mean by that, and we can talk about that, of course, on Wednesday as well. On the opposite end, if you're a Trump fan, you're fanatically loyal to this guy. It doesn't matter what he does. It doesn't matter what he says. It doesn't matter what damage he causes. You will follow him to the very end. Why? Because Trump owns the libs, right? That's it. I will burn half this country down just to own the libs. And if you're thinking, well, this doesn't make any sense, you're not part of that group preference, right? Why do people believe the things that they believe? Because group preferences connects the fate of the individual with the group through some collective identification and common fate. And what this does, and this is very, very important, is that connecting to the group creates an us-them understanding of the world. Now, this may sound very, very simplistic, but it is one of the most important things to understand about culture. Us versus them. We, the whatever, the good guys, them, the bad guys. And I don't want to say good, bad connotation here, but there has to always be an other. There always has to be a non-group member or a non-group group. If there is no other, there really is no identity, right? If everybody felt the same way, acted the same way, believed the same way, there really wouldn't be this idea of culture because there's nothing to bounce culture, ideas, preferences off of. So yes, it's just as important to be a Yankees fan knowing that there is the existence of, the Mets or the Red Sox. Yes, it is important to be a Giants fan knowing that there are Eagles fans and Cowboys fans out there. Yes, it is important for you to be a fan of FC Munich, knowing full well that there is, FC Barcelona out there, right? There needs to be an other for you to constantly, juxtapose, to, balance out your own identity. And all of these create something that we're going to be reading later on in the semester. Imagined communities, right? All of what I've been talking about right now, the creation of group preferences, are all designed around institutions that humans create themselves, right? To be a Yankees fan is an imagined community. To be a Joe Biden fan is certainly an imagined community. To be part of the Trump, nation is an imagined community. These things don't exist by default. They exist. These communities exist simply because we believe them to exist. We create these communities. And in many cases, we get emotionally involved over things of our own creation. We get angry over things we make up ourselves. We get proud over things we make up ourselves. Okay? Now, this might imply that group identity creates homogeneity, right? That's not necessarily the case. I just want to quickly add a footnote to point 2 by suggesting that group preferences do not homogenize everyone, but at the absolute least, they group everybody together by the most important macro-social identities. So if you're a Yankees fan, sure, you might be a Yankees fan because you love the history of the Yankees, you're a native of New York, you know some of the best ball players ever came from the Yankee, you know, this, that, the other thing, right? But you can be a Yankees fan without hating the Red Sox. You can be a Yankees fan without hating the Mets. You can be a Yankees fan just simply because your father was a Yankees fan, your grandfather was a Yankees fan, and you feel that you owe it to your family ancestors to keep the tradition going, right? What makes you a fan of something? What makes you a supporter of something? Well, there's a lot of overlap, but then when you ask the individual more specific questions, right, you can get a little bit more of a nuanced answer here. And you ask me, hey, Rossi, why are you a Bernie Sanders supporter? And I'm saying, because the guy just, honestly, in my opinion, cares about the future of this country. Now, some of you might be agreeing with me. Others might be saying, oh, God, I really hope this wasn't a political class here. But, again, why do we believe what we believe? Why did you choose the major that you chose in LIU? Why did you choose to go to LIU? Do you have some sentimental reason? Do you have a family member that went here? Is it close by? Is it just, whatever's the reason? We, as group preferences, we as students and faculty at LIU, I guess we have some kind of collective identity, some kind of group preference. I like to think that we, believe that, hey, I'm learning and working in Brooklyn. There's a certain working class attitude, that comes along with that. Do we have different specific nuances? Sure. But there's, our similarities outweigh our individual differences. Okay? The third aspect, the third contribution of culture, okay, we're taking this one step further and further. Okay, now that we have gotten to the point where culture creates group identities, culture also shapes and defines the group boundaries. In other words, who's in and who's out, right? So this continues that discussion of us versus them. And at this point, it's not so much where we differentiate between us and them like we did before, but now we have group preferences, rubrics, and rules that will determine who is acceptable, who is qualified to become part of our group, and who really isn't. So even if there are new members that want to join, new adherents, new signups, new applicants, new, whatever it is, right? The group can therefore look at the list of, hopefuls, recruits, whatever it is you want to look at, and figure out, okay, 1, 4, 7, and 8, are included. And, welcome to the, welcome to the club. 2, 3, 5, and, 6? No. I don't know. Just something there just doesn't make right. You do better, someplace else. What also happens with group boundaries, and this is where things get even more interesting, is that even within the group, there's different layers of familiarity and commonality. So group preferences and identities can be adjusted also to different localities depending upon where one is. So I could say, and I'll find out on Wednesday if this is true, that all of you who have signed up for this class are Americans, okay? Either by birth or by paperwork. And if that's the case, you're all American citizens, you all vote in November, you all have the same rights and privileges. What that does is that differentiates us from, let's say, Canadians or Mexicans or Icelanders or French in that sense, right? But the concept of American identity really only matters if there is a number of non Americans in the group. And those non Americans are prominent enough to, project their non American identity. Right. So if there are, I'm just going to come up with just random people here, if there's like 5 people from Ghana and 3 from Japan and, 2 from Madagascar and another one from Egypt or whatever it is, and there's only a small group of, let's say, Americans, doesn't matter where we come from. Right? So, we all come from one of the 50 states. We start gravitating together because, all of a sudden the Americanness makes us a unique group of people vis-a-vis the others that come from their own individual countries. But if there's no non-Americans in the group, and we're all from the United States, now all of a sudden, we start differentiating even amongst ourselves. What region of the country are you from? Are you from the East Coast? Are you from the West Coast? Are you from the Midwest? Are you from the South? I mean, as far as American pop culture and political culture is concerned, what we call the American South, the old Confederacy, there still is a solidarity among them, right? This guy's from Alabama, this one's from Georgia, and they're going to just have a lot more in common. They'll probably share a lot more drinks than the guy from, Wisconsin or New Hampshire, for that matter. But even if we realize that we're all from the same area, now all of a sudden we go even further within that region. And, if we're from the East Coast, now suddenly, where does everybody come from? And, the majority of you, I would assume, come from New York or, New York City. And, I ask, where in New York are you from? Some Brooklyn here, Queens there, a few people Manhattan. Every so often you get someone that crosses the Verrazano from Staten Island. And, is it fair enough to say that there is an identity, a discernible identity that separates people from New York City, from New York State, or from New York and New Jersey? I know that, within New Jersey, at least where I'm from, we have a lot more commonalities with New Yorkers because most of us are descendants from New York immigrants. My father is an immigrant coming to this country from Europe. I like to joke that I'm also an immigrant since my father also, migrated a few years later from New York to New Jersey, right? So I'm the child of, I am an immigrant, myself here. And you look at southern New Jersey, and for me, I'm like, these people are weird. For them, when they say I'm going to the city, they don't mean New York. They have this weird tendency of saying Philadelphia. And I'm like, no, man, when you say you're going to the city for the evening, you're going to New York. If you're going to go to Philadelphia, you say I'm going to Philadelphia. And if you live right outside of Philadelphia and you say I'm going to the city, well, you better get on that train because it's about a 2-hour train ride to get to New York. Because if you mean Philadelphia, then say Philadelphia because no, that ain't the city. Philadelphia is nice, but it's kind of like a section of Brooklyn with a skyline. That's about it. You can tell where my loyalties and my identities lie. But even within New Jersey, and man, we can do an anthropological study about just the different nuances of northern, southern, and this mythological area called Central Jersey, right? Are there traits and characteristics that differentiate all of us? Sure. And if there's no one else in the group but people from New Jersey, yeah, we're going to find out real quickly who's from North Jersey, who's from Central Jersey, and who are the weirdos from South Jersey. And the only time that New Jersey solidarity will come in, I am from, let's say, central northern New Jersey. And I have very little in common with, crazy, people down in South Jersey. But the minute somebody from Pennsylvania makes fun of that southern Jersey hick, I will defend his honor in a bar fight. And I'll be like, get the fuck back over the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, you Amish. Don't touch my boy here, But when we're by ourselves, I'm just going to, I'll probably make fun of him. He'll make fun of me, whatever it is, right? And we can break this down layer by layer by layer, by county, by town where I'm from. And even within where I'm from, we have 2 high schools. And when someone says they're from Edison, I'm like, okay, I need to find out. This is the big question. Are you from J.P. Stevens or are you Edison High? And if you're from one, you're my, brother, sister. And if you're from the other one, technically we're at war, because we have a rival football team. You see where I'm going with this? Identity is in layers. And depending upon the environment, and depending upon the other, depending upon the them, your us identity is going to take on a unique shape. And, it is going to try to differentiate as much as possible from one person, to the other. If all we had in class were students from Brooklyn and Queens, right? I'm pretty certain we can find nuanced differences, right? We have character traits of people who are from Brooklyn, and we got character traits from people who are from Queens, right? And to the outsider, it doesn't matter because, hey, you all sound like this to somebody who lives in Idaho or whatever, So my point is that culture has different layers of identities, different meanings, depending upon group identity. One thing I want to bring up as, you're taking notes here, and I don't want to spend too much time on it now because I know that we're pressed for time. Well, we will make a note of this in the next coming weeks when we look at path dependency. But the group boundaries and the us-them understanding also has something to do within political science, anthropology, sociology, history. We have this thing, it's an annoying thing, but it's unavoidable, called path dependency, or more specifically, path-dependent legacies. What this means is that, in so many words, where you come from determines who, what, and where you are now. And who, what, and where you are now is going to have some kind of influence, effect, on where you go in the future. Okay? So, if you, let's say, come from, a working class background. Okay? You come from a working class background. Chances are you're not going to have as much of a likely opportunity to go to an Ivy League school than if you were born into richer upper class affluence, especially if you didn't have any family members that went to Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, right? Because, you apply to these Ivy League schools, there's always that question on the form, hey, do you have any relatives that went there? And then, of course, if the answer is yes, how much money have they given in, endowments or in alumni support and this, that, the other thing, right? And if you don't have any connections, it's not like you can't get in, but it's much more difficult, okay? And, the major that you chose in LIU right now, whether it's nursing or pharmacy or business or physical therapy or, athletics or whatever it is, right? That major is going to set you on some kind of career path that is very different from if you had chosen something else. I went to college and I double majored in political science and history. And that kind of set me on my path to go to grad school for my PhD in political science. And, because I have a history interest and I'm more interested in qualitative studies than quantitative, I'm teaching this class on culture, which, has a lot of anthropological, aspects to it. I'm also working at LIU because, I come from New Jersey and I made the decision that, I really don't want to travel abroad or, when I say travel abroad, I'm saying, traveling across the country. I like it here, right? I like being in the shadow of New York. I like working in New York. Everyone wants to work in New York. And, hey, what's even better than working in New York? Working in Brooklyn, nuanced idiosyncrasies of LIU notwithstanding. But again, group boundaries also influence future actions and help explain past practices as well. All right, number 4, right? We're 4 out of 5 so far. Once we've reached this stage, culture provides a framework for interpreting the actions and motives of others. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Here's where it gets both interesting and complicated. Because at this point, if we are part of a group, we think a certain way, we identify with certain things, we have our own characteristics and idiosyncrasies, we're going to look at the world and we're going to look at what other people do through the rational lenses of our own way of understanding how and why the world works. And this is important to note because motives are central to cultural analysis. in that they offer a mechanism to link individual action with a broader social setting. What do I mean by this? I mean that our interpretation of the actions and the motives of others, and the actions and motives of what we do, regardless of how they are interpreted by others, are linked very closely to what we call rational choice theory. Now, this is even more complicated and annoying than path dependency, but equally unavoidable. Rational choice theory is, in so many words, an understanding that we do what we do based on some kind of utilitarian rationalization, right? So, for instance, we do things not because we necessarily want to, but because we have to. One non-political way of explaining this is, at the beginning of every month, you have bills to pay, right? You have rent to pay, you have a phone bill to pay, you have student loans to pay, you have a car loan payment to pay, you have a whole bunch of stuff that you have to pay. Now, no one that I know would voluntarily do this, right? No one I know would voluntarily tell their landlord, sure, $1,800 for a studio apartment, you got it. But you pay that because there are penalties for not doing it. What are the penalties for not paying your rent? Right? Well, you can be evicted. You can have a fine accrued. What are the penalties for not paying your phone bill? You end up losing your phone privileges or your internet link. What's the penalty for not paying your electric bill? After a while, they shut off the electricity. So you do certain things, not because you like doing them, but you do them because it helps avoid a more undesirable outcome down the road. So, within politics, there's a book that was written about 10, 15 years ago called What's the Matter with Kansas by Thomas Frank. And, the question of the book is really the research question. Why did a bunch of blue-collar working white communities in Kansas vote in 2004 for George W. Bush instead of John Kerry, knowing that at the time John Kerry's platform offered better opportunities, better incentives, and better policies for working class families in rural America than the more corporate-oriented politics of George W. Bush. And, from a strictly economic, academic point of view, you kind of look at the ways in which poor white people will vote for, Bush or Trump or, any of these Republicans that are more than happy to see you die and say, well, these people are stupid. Rational choice theory reminds you, no, they're not stupid. No, they are not stupid. Trust me, sometimes I look at what America does, and I have to convince myself that, no, they're not stupid. Why did working class white families in Kansas vote for George W. Bush? Because Bush and the Republicans adopted a more conservative cultural attitude than the Democrats. And the one thing was that Bush was adamantly opposed to abortion. Adamantly opposed to abortion, adamantly opposed to gay marriage and gay rights. John Kerry, a little bit more, flexible. But then again, it's the Democrats. So a lot of people will think, well, Kerry, Hillary, Biden, they'll hold their finger up to the wind and see, what's, lucrative in order to win an election. But the Republicans are pretty clear on their policies, whether you like it or not. And that got a good number of working class white families to vote for them, just as if they're going to vote for Trump now. You might know a Trump voter, and you ask them, why are you voting for Trump? And the answer is, because he's making America great. And you got to look at them and say, they honestly believe that. And you could ask them why. You might not like the explanation, but, we don't vote for someone that we don't like. Except maybe for Biden, you're going to vote for Biden because you don't like Trump. But if you vote for Trump in this election, you are voting for him because you like his policies, right? Because of something that resonates. And what I'm trying to get at here is that rat choice theory shows that the interests and motives of an outside culture might not necessarily be the same rational understanding compared to one's own interests and motives. And so one of the big problems in cultural analysis these days is that there are a lot of academics, and even more so policymakers, that look at things around the world and they look at what people are doing, what they're not doing, what they're upholding, what they're fighting against, and they'll just say, that's fucked up. These people are stupid. They have no concept of democracy. They have no concept of diversity or inclusion, blah, 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 right? And, for the few of us that, have done this long enough, our answer is, yeah, I know it may look fucked up to you, but this is what they believe in. And right now, to tell them that they're screwed up or that they're doing something wrong is not going to help. It's only going to alienate them even further. Okay? Well, finally, we reach number 5. After all of this, we have organized culture, we have grouped culture, we have differentiated culture, and we have tried to rationally analyze culture. Culture frames organizational preferences for political mobilization. So once the group has kind of come up with their little manifesto about who we are, what's important, what's not important, what we defend, what we try to reject, this is now translated into some kind of political action. And here is where the political science comes into this. Culture is now used as a political tool. So we started out in the anthropological. We gradually evolved through the psychological and sociological until we get to point 5, the political scientific. And if culture is used as a political tool, it is used in a way to define a group's distinctiveness through some overt ritual of unity. So the group doesn't have to necessarily be political like a government or politics, but some kind of, institutionalized organization. The group will reassert its values and its identities, repeatedly throughout the year through some kind of ritual. Now, I'm not talking about some arcane, underground ritual, but, what we do. We celebrate July 4th. That's a ritual. We celebrate Thanksgiving. That's a ritual. If you happen to be a little bit more on the left, you're going to do, more on Labor Day than just barbecue and drink beer. You'll probably, promote unions or, play working class songs or, whatever it happens to be. A couple of days ago, we had 9/11, right? 19 years since 9/11 happened. Now, most of you, I'm going to assume, have no working knowledge of 9/11. I can tell you, as someone that was old enough, I was in grad school at the time, the first year anniversary of 9/11, the whole country came to a standstill. We had one ginormous ritual of remembering. Yesterday or 2 days ago, depending upon when you're listening to this, 9/11 comes and goes. A few people on my Facebook wall, post the whole never forget. And, most of the time, the people who post that tend to be more conservative. They tend to be more right-wing. And they link all of that with, hey, this should remind you about why you shouldn't, be angry at police officers, this, that, the other. And so they're politicizing, sort of the whole thing. And a whole bunch of other people have just forgotten it, sort of altogether. It's not like they have disregarded it, but, it's kind of fading from memory. But this ritual, this sense of group display of unity, is used to meet the political needs of communication within the group. So it's a way of trying to once again assert what's important, what the group identifies as, and it's a way for the group to market itself to, would-be new members that might want to join their ranks or associate with them as opposed to others. This is used to offer mechanisms for decision-making, for problems confronting the entire group, used to provide authority for implementing decisions, and for speaking on behalf of the group, and finally used to meet the need for discipline through ceremonies and rituals that connect an ideology to current problems. Now, by this point, right, the cultural creation has long since passed. And, we're looking at, years, maybe even generations that have passed. A lot of times, the original cultural concept can become blurred, can almost become, sort of very gradually changed, to the point where the group that identifies, at least rhetorically, with certain cultural traits and values end up reflecting group practices and rituals that are significantly different from, what's in the guidelines, what's in the Constitution, what's in their, initial rubricks. To this, right, and not all the times this works, but religion can be a very effective tool if politics is not involved. And, let me just take a brief moment here to talk about the relationship between religion and culture, because there's a lot of people that, are out there that will say, religion is detrimental, it's nationalistic, it's racist, it's xenophobic, and if you're, one of those internet atheists, we get rid of religion and everything will be fine. Wrong, 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 and wrong. I happen to, respect religion. I understand the important value that religion has as a group institution and as an organization. But when culture, and even more so political culture, come into the discussion, and religion is hanging out there at the same time, rarely when religion is used is theology, actual religious theology, actual religious dogma considered. 9 times out of 10, when we talk about religion and culture, religion and identity, it is, again, 9 times out of 10, seen as a socio-cultural institution. Rarely, when people argue about religion, does theology ever come into play. When you talk about the evangelical Christian movement in this country, right, and if you really think about this, okay, evangelical Christianity, very conservative, very parochial, almost reactionary, to a degree. What is evangelical Christianity based on? Christianity. What are the basic tenets of Christianity? Things and philosophies that are very, very socialistic, right? So I always annoy right-wingers when I say Jesus was a Marxist before Marx was Marxist. Jesus was a good democratic socialist. Jesus was a very, very good communitarian, right? The fundamental rubrics of Christianity are extremely left-wing. They are anti-establishment. They are anti-authoritarian. They are all group inclusive. So you got to think, how did this religion become the embodiment of right-wing conservative white nationalism in this country? There's no one answer to that, but I can tell you this much. Theology rarely comes into effect. It is more so simply used as a way of defining a certain demographic vis-a-vis non-Christians, particularly Jews, Hindus, Muslims, atheists, and, more working class Christians like Catholics or Orthodox in that sense. But religion definitely has a role to play in defining culture. But once again, rarely does the actual religious philosophies, God very rarely comes into the equation. Okay? It oftentimes is what religion serves as a cultural unifying tool. Okay? And to these 5 that are taken from the Ross article, there is an honorary 6th that I pulled from the Richard Wilson piece, The Many Faces of Political Culture. And it's the last quote-unquote face in that article. And this is a little complicated, but I think that you're going to appreciate the understanding here. Wilson notes that culture functions as cognitive epistemology, right? Cognitive epistemology, which means that culture provides meaning and rationales, here's the underlying word, with experience. So what does Wilson mean here? I like this because it shows that culture is constantly dynamic, organic, and growing. Wilson makes the observation by saying that values, cultural values, traditional values, just whatever we understand to be important at the moment, are conditioned on social, economic, geographic, and mnemonic conditions, mnemonic memory conditions. Okay? So I'll use myself as a guinea pig once again. All right, I've already laid bare the fact that I'm a Bernie Sanders fan here. I was not on the left my entire life. In fact, growing up as a kid in suburban New Jersey and having pretty much a good life. Up to, I would say, roughly 2005, 2006, I was right-wing. I was a Republican. And in high school, white kid in the suburbs, left to their own devices without proper historical teaching. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm one of those kids that's going to take up a gun because we didn't do that back then. But, watched Fox News, listened to Rush Limbaugh, listened to Sean Hannity. I drew the line at Mark Levin. I couldn't stand him back then, and I still can't stand him now. But, I was a whole America lover, leave it, you don't like it, get out type of thing, right? What happened? What happened? Well, I mean, I grew up. You experience a few financial pitfalls here or there. I got my PhD, and I ended up immediately becoming unemployed. That's always fun. PhD is a nice thing to stand for, please hire desperate. I lived abroad for, a couple of months here and there. Just, you kind of discovered how the rest of the world works. And, you kind of come back with, I'd like to say, a learning experience, which at least for me, shifted me away from the, patriotic jingoism of the Bush years. To the point where, I believe that if I'm going to be a raging American nationalist and I'm going to believe that we're the greatest country in the solar system, well, then we need to have the proper socio-political institutions to take care of our citizens. And a part of that is, hey, I'm a New Deal Democrat. I believe in the power of unions. I believe that we should have universal health care. I believe that there should be a far higher minimum wage than we have right now. I believe that the environment is much more important than profit margins for fossil fuel companies. This is just, look, I'm not trying to instill anything on you. I mean, if you're agreeing with me, great. And if you don't, that's fine too. But I'm showing you that my cultural beliefs, principles, and values have also changed over time. It is a learning by experience. When we learn by experience, our values and our preferences are usually affected by, exogenous stimuli. So, things happen in our lives, and that might change the way that we look at the world. In some cases, exogenous stimuli could turn an otherwise innocuous centrist into a raging Trumpaholic. I know a lot of people that were pushed more and more to the right, by the same reasons, by the same socioeconomic reasons. But instead of, I went to the left, I know a number of people that went to the right. We can talk more about cognitive epistemology in class on Wednesday. I think there's a lot of really good examples that we can bring in, especially when the role of memory comes in. But bottom line with cognitive epistemology is that it adds to our understanding of culture as a dynamic variable. This is probably the most important thing to take away from cognitive epistemology, is that culture is dynamic, right? Culture is not monolithic. It is not rigid, fixed, and unchanging. But culture, cultural beliefs, the ways in which we do things, they change over time. And they change with our growing values, our needs and preferences, as well as what we, feel is worth defending at some point. Things that I felt worth defending in my 20s, okay, are very different than what I feel worth defending now in my, however old I happen to be, right? But it shows that culture is adaptable to change, okay? And in that case, it shows that there is not one group that is somehow blessed with a better culture over another group that is forever cursed for the wrong beliefs and practices. What is true What is true about about cognitive epistemology is that it will always place importance on those things we hold dear. Some things that we hold dear, we get rid of. Other things that we didn't even regard at some point in our lives now become incredibly important depending on changing circumstances. One small example before we wrap this up. When I was a kid, my father's side of the family all migrated over from Europe to Ridgewood, Queens. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Ridgewood. You just take Myrtle Avenue all the way out east. Today, there's a lot of Poles, Serbs, Romanians, right? There's still some, good German restaurants. We are Austrian. And my grandparents, from overseas, whenever they would have a party, a birthday, an anniversary, or whatever, they would go to this bakery, Rudy's Bakery. It's on Seneca in Ridgewood. Still there. It's got a Facebook page, got an Instagram account, right? And as a kid, I hated Rudy's. You want to know why? Because as a kid, when we have cake, you know what I want? I want Carvel. I want Oreos, right? I want ice cream cake. And what did the old, Alpine Austrians get? They got, lemon coconut cake. They got, Black Forest cake. And as a kid, you're like, this is old people cake. I don't want this. Better yet, it was a German bakery, so they would have like German donuts as opposed to Dunkin' Donuts. They had this thing called Bienenstich, which is German for bee sting. It's a honey cake. And the old timers, they loved it. Me, I hated it. But guess what? Everyone's gone. Grandparents have passed on. The aunts and uncles have passed on. There's very few of, the family left. My father is going to be 80 next year. Rudy's is still there. And at some point when I begin to miss all of that, I decided one day, you know what? Just for the hell of it, I'm going to go into Rudy's and I'm going to get one of those cakes. And I said to my father, I'm going to get the Bienenstich, the bee sting cake. And he looked at me and was like, wow. It's like, yeah, I know. I brought it home. I gave it to him to eat. And it was just like, it took him back, 30, 35 years. And me, you know what? I love it now. I'll eat it all the time. So in a way, this is a very simple example of the changing nature of culture and what's important. Because when you lose, a good chunk of your family, you want to hold on to whatever shards of it are left. When everybody's around and you're an insufferable teenager, you can't stand this stuff. And then when you get older and you start to get, more reflective on life, this stuff's important, right? This stuff is absolutely important, okay? All right, so I think I'm going to stop here. I think this is a real good stopping point because I want to save the David Laitin reading for next time. I think we can talk about a lot of stuff in our class on Wednesday, and I don't want to shortchange Laitin. I think that's very, very important. I also want to make certain that everybody is comfortable in this class. I'll wait for ad drop before we get to the first readings here. So your homework assignment after listening to this video is just that small little request that I did in the beginning of this video. So make certain that you email me those aspects of culture, and we can talk about that. If you've done the reading, great, right? You can sit back for a couple of days. Your homework assignment for next week, for next Wednesday, is to read the chapter in David Laitin, Hegemony and Culture, and the article about Dr. Martin Luther King. And that, I think, is a really good combination because we will talk about the two faces of culture in detail next time around. If we take the time on Wednesday to really look at the aspects of culture and figure out how to combine this for your research analysis, you're going to be in a far better shape to do Laitin and Sugrue the following week, right? I know we're doing it slowly. I don't think you're going to have to worry about, being saddled with too many readings. Remember, this is a 2-for-1 class. You're learning about culture, but you're also learning how to be awesome college students. So I look forward to finally meeting you in a couple of days. If after this video you have any questions or ideas that you want to bring up, please shoot me an email. I should be available throughout the rest of the weekend, and we can certainly talk on Zoom or Skype on Tuesday before we convene as a group. So so all else being considered, enjoy the rest of the weekend. Or if you are listening to this on Monday, I hope you had a good weekend. But either way, I will see you in a few days on Wednesday. All right? Cheers, everyone.